Lesson 8, Self-Control. I read a charming little cartoon book many years ago. I believe the name was A Love Affair Between a Line and a Dot. The story of this book was that the line fell in love with the dot, and the dot was quite indifferent to the blandishments of the line, and therefore the line began to try to make itself more attractive. And it bent itself up into all sorts of squiggles and disordered messes, and the dot was completely aloof. And finally the line decided that if it was going to win the love of the dot, it must get control over its self-expression, and it began to bend itself with a great deal of precision, great deal of self-control. It began to form very disciplined patterns, and the dot became interested. And then it continued with this very disciplined procedure, self-development, until finally the dot fell in love with the line. And the moral of the book was, to the vector belong the spoils. Well, this charming story makes a very important point, that self-control is not the kind of grim self-discipline that so many people think of it as. It's the necessary thing, that kind of self-discipline that makes it possible for you to bring about a decent product, a decent job, a decent book, a decent action, whatever it might be, something that will be magnetic rather than just self-expressive. A lot of energy in our century has been devoted to self-expression without discipline. I suspect that a great deal of modern art, finally, when the votes are all in a century or two from now, will be completely discounted, even though now people feel that in the name of artistic integrity they're expressing themselves as they feel. 100 years from now, or as far as I'm concerned right now, that self-expression is totally meaningless because it has no control. It has no self-discipline. It isn't an effort to communicate with me or with anyone else. It's just an effort to sort of spray out into the world whatever thoughts and feelings and so-called inspirations happen to come into the mind. Now, if you want your leadership to be magnetic, then both your leadership and you yourself will have to give emphasis to this quality of self-control. Be controlled in what you say. People who speak too much are rarely the people who accomplish anything. A person of few words has energy left over to devote to his work, but if a person talks too much, then he will probably not have the energy to act. Let your words be few but meaningful. Let your actions be few but meaningful. Whatever you do, do it with concentration, and don't do it just to express yourself. That's why I talked in the last class about being impersonal. That we need to stop thinking in terms of what do I want to express, and more in terms of what needs to be done. A musician who doesn't try to attune himself, his instrument, to the orchestra will play out of tune with it and create cacophony. A person who thinks that he can learn to play the piano well without learning techniques for playing the piano will never be a great pianist. He may be a good amateur, but that's the most he'll be. We need to learn our trade, whatever it might be. It can be an ordinary trade like writing or making shoes or whatever. Or it can be the more subtle act of working with other people, where you don't see things being done, and yet the effect is the same. Through those other people, things are accomplished, goals are achieved. In all of these cases, you will find that with control, with self-control, you'll be able to... See, self-control means different things to different people, but what I'm trying to bring out through this concept is the reining in of unnecessary expenditure of energy in order to direct it deliberately, meaningfully, with feeling, with concentration, toward a specific end. And particularly people who like to work by inspiration tend not to be aware of how very self-controlled they need to be in their inspiration in order to make it work. They'll say, well, I prayed over it maybe, and this great thing came, or I had this wonderful idea that came to me in sleep, and let's do it. Well, you have to adjust those inspirations to reality. In fact, many of them are not really inspirations at all. They're just sort of whims. Adjust them to reality, and this takes a lot of self-control, doesn't it? Another thing with any person in a position of leadership is that if he doesn't have control over his emotions, then it will be very difficult to get people to really listen to him. I've observed this in families where the parents argue. The children stop listening to the parents. They don't have that kind of respect for their parents, which their parents ought to have, ought to be able to command. Whereas a parent who is stern, not necessarily unloving, but definite in what he says, and definite in his intentions, in his discipline, in his directives, this is the parent that the children will tend much more to respect. If I look back over the teachers that I had in school, I remember some teachers who were eager to please their students. And I remember other teachers who were really quite stern disciplinarians. And the ones that all of the students remembered with fondness, believe it or not, were the more disciplinarian ones. I don't mean those who were irrationally so. That's not self-control either. But those who were self-controlled enough to say what they mean and mean what they say. And the children listened. They gained a lot more from them. It's much more magnetic, because then your mind, your energy, it all comes back to energy, doesn't it? Your energy is directed instead of being sprayed in all ways. If there's a leak in the electric wire, the flow, even though the initial energy coming into it may be strong, the actual flow of energy through the wire will be weak, and the magnetic field will therefore be weak. When you can have your energy enough under your control that you can put it in any, or direct it in any way that you want, then you will have the magnetism to be able to attract the goals, attract the ideas, the circumstances, the people. Everything will tend to come out right when you have that degree of discipline over your own thoughts, your own feelings, your emotions, your speech. And remember, I don't mean when I say this that it should be that kind of rigid control that creates inner tension. I don't mean that. I mean just gradually bringing your mind back and directing it where it ought to go. That kind of discipline, that kind of self-discipline, self-control will lead to great accomplishments in your life.